Today I'm going to provide you with some background information about American poet Li Young Lee and identify some of the stylistic impulses and thematic topics addressed by many Asian American writers in poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. So let's start with Li Young Lee. This is a picture of him. Interestingly, we had him on our campus several years ago as the keynote speaker for the Faith and Writing Conference that the English department hosts every few years. In the slide deck, which is posted in the long module in our Canvas course, you can find some biographical details. You can also learn about his family, specifically his father, who is a really important focus in many of the poems in Rose. There's also information in that slide deck about his academic background, so you can see which universities he attended, a list of his publications. This could be helpful to you if you are interested in reading more of the poetry and nonfiction prose written by Lee. And I've included a long list of his awards. It's important to me that you understand how accomplished he is as a writer so that you'll see why I've chosen to use his poetry collection for consideration in our course. I've chosen Rose because it was the first of his poetry collections, but I would encourage you, if you enjoy what you see in that book, to read some of the other books so you can learn more about him and get more familiar with his voice, because clearly he's been very influential in American literature. So some of the preoccupations that you'll see in Rose include some of these topics. So Li Young Lee is very preoccupied with death, not because he is fearful of it or because he's fascinated with the decomposition of the body. Rather, he views death as a mysterious and beautiful continuation of human life. He really sees death as a holy experience. And his writing is mystical primarily because he believes absolutely in the oneness of all things, human beings, nature, the spirit, philosophy, the human intellect, the past, the present, the future. He really is committed to this idea that all things are connected in some singular way. He also focuses a great deal in Rose on his childhood, and many of his poems are inspired by his memories of experiences with his father and his mother. He also writes about his relationship with his wife, but the primary figure that emerges most consistently in Rose is Lee's father. Li Young Lee is also committed to celebrating the holiness of language. To be a good reader of his poetry, we need to be curious not only about the subject matter of the poems, but curious about the language that he uses to engage us with imagery, with ideas, with sound. All of these things are a significant aspect of his work as a writer. He also has some stylistic tendencies, particularly in this collection. Some of these tendencies are evident in other collections as well, but I would say some of them are probably more specific to Rose. For one, he likes to create silences in his poems, and he accomplishes this through line breaks, punctuation that might create slight pauses in the syntax of a particular line. He also uses white space and stanza formation purposefully to create open space where the reader can really think for a moment and reflect on what he or she has encountered so far in the poem. He uses personal experience to launch these beautiful lyrical meditations on universal truths, universal ideas, and universal experiences. Ordinary things that are part of daily life, such as meal taking and bathing and sleeping and even dying. His posture is clearly mystical, but he's still tied to the tangible things of the world. He's interested in the food we eat, the sensation that our fingers experience when we touch one another's bodies, when we touch the elements of nature, food, fabric, those kinds of things. So I think you might see a little bit of a similarity between how Li Yunli approaches the world and how Naomi Shihab Nye approaches the world in 19 Varieties of Gazelle. Their tone is very different, and the landscapes they evoke are very different, but their attention to and regard for the tangible, concrete, ordinary trappings of human life, that's very much the same in their work. In Book of My Nights, he makes some statements that I think are very engaging, and so I would encourage you to read that maybe this summer when you have more time to choose your own readings. It's a memoir, a collection of essays, a kind of memoir in which he reflects on his life, his writing, poetry in general. So I think you'd really find it interesting. And in an interview with a writer for Poets and Writers magazine, Lee makes this particular statement about that memoir. I think I had to go through some real wilderness, tangled vines and trees, and being lost in Book of My Nights, confusion about who I am and what's going on, and what is language, what's a poem, why am I writing, all that stuff, to get to his next book of poetry. Rose was his first book of poetry. He wrote Book of My Nights several years later, and then he's referencing in this statement the other books of poetry that he wrote. So I think that interview and also Book of My Nights would really help you to understand the longer curve of his work as an artist. Lee considers every poem to be a descendant of God. So his belief in the oneness of things extends beyond the physical, tangible world into the divine. And he sees poetry as a kind of communion and ongoing communication between God and human beings. He's fascinated by the human body and sees it as a sensual and sacred figure. So the human body is not profane in Lee's estimation. In fact, it is the very thing that allows us to experience sensual and deep connection to our Creator. Okay, the other information that I want to share with you today has to do with some of the prominent features and themes that emerge in much of the Asian American literature that exists right now. One of those themes is the privacy of the individual, and this is relevant to Lee's poetry simply because there's such a quietness and an intimacy in all of his poems that you experience your invitation to read those poems as a kind of invitation into his private world, into his private thoughts, his private memories. So in that way, he's not scorning those things that we usually keep private. Rather, he is celebrating and honoring those things and giving his readers a chance to perceive and experience those private moments with him. Integrity and honor is another common theme in Asian American literature. The things that are related to this that we see most clearly in Rose would be a reflection of the strong ties that Lee has to his parents. He does look on the human community as this larger familial community. He isn't preoccupied with the risk of shame, but he does honor his parents in these poems and meditates kind of indirectly on his own connection to his heritage. Ethnic identity and autonomy are themes that often emerge. Family ties are viewed as sacred, and the authority of the grandfather or father is, in some cases, viewed as sacred and absolute, but in others, definitely as vulnerable. And I think that's one of the things that Lee is struggling to do in this poem, is figure out a way to honor and express his love for his father. The last topic that I want to highlight for today is the topic of stylistic impulses that we often find in the poetry, fiction, and nonfiction created by Asian American writers. Some of these we see very, very clearly in Rose. Others may not be present at all, but I think it could be helpful for you to look for some of these as you read the poems this week. The first is a reverence and respect for nature, and this is absolutely clear in Rose. Nature imagery is pervasive in his poetry, and he doesn't just view them as background or reduce the elements of nature to simple vehicles through which he can discover something philosophical or intellectual. His treatment of nature is a kind of worship, not deification, but a respectful reverence for the sublime beauty in nature. I think we do see a longing for serenity, and because he is not at peace regarding his relationship with his ethnic past or his relationship with his father, and because he is still grieving the death of his father, he isn't experiencing a sense of serenity in his spirit. And so writing Rose was perhaps an effort to discover and move toward the kind of serenity that he longs for. Very obviously, we see complex linguistic structures in his poems. Some of his syntax is pretty straightforward, where he's using kind of conventional sentence structure, but we also see listing, we also see many fragments, we see some poems that are one long continuous thought. So it is important important for you to pay attention to how he's using poetry and how he is creating a kind of imaginative, associative journey in each of the poems. He often explains very little. You will not find a great deal of exposition in his poems. Instead, he will present images and experiences and perceptions to you, and then allow you to meditate on those and make decisions yourself about what they evoke or what they might mean. Frequent employment of minimalist expression rather than extravagant or flamboyant language. This is a characteristic that we will see very clearly both in Rose and in When the Emperor Was Divine, which is the novel we'll read next week. The language in neither of these works is verbose. Both writers employ understatement and a very simple, direct, and clear presentation of characters and imagery. Both writers trust and respect the reader's ability to respond interpretively to these minimalist depictions of human life, human activity, elements in nature. There's also a lot of attention to the disparities that exist between the exterior world that we all inhabit and the interior world that we inhabit privately. So I think that that's another aspect of the narrative posture that we see in both Lee's Rose and Otsuka's When the Emperor Was Divine. I hope that these tips and observations about both Rose and the larger canon of Asian American literature will increase your ability to enter into and fully enjoy this collection.